Biden in a landslide. Never look at American political polls until after the conventions, because until that point, the independents aren't answering the phone. There are fewer Republicans than Democrats, and the Republican strength at the national level has always been about unity. Trump broke that, so he isn't even going to have all traditional people on the right showing up. Second, we've got this little issue with a challenging guy from the outside, Robert Kennedy Jr., who is, how should I say this most discreetly, he's challenging Trump for the batshit crazy vote that Trump thought he had cornered. Now it's split. And third, and in my opinion, most importantly, people have just forgotten what happened 2 years ago in our midterms. Donald Trump told independent voters that their vote doesn't matter, that it should all be resolved at the primaries, which is where he rules. And their collective response was, hold my beer. And for most of the candidates that he put his finger on to support, independents voted against the Trump candidates 4-1. We have never had a national election in the United States in which the Republicans won, in which the Republicans didn't capture 2/3 of the independents. So we are looking at the second or the third greatest election wipeout in American history for Trump and his allies. And that's before you consider that Trump is now a convicted felon. I'd argue that it's two sides of the same coin. I don't mean to suggest that the two leaders are the same on foreign policy. They're not. But on foreign economic policy, Biden's actually the more isolationist of the two. Biden is much more comfortable working with the tools of power and with the tools of the bureaucracy. And when it comes to economic policy, trade barriers, tariffs, state policy, industrialization policy, national economic restrictions, he's been an order of magnitude more involved. And he's ensured that his policy set will outlive him. And what we're seeing in the United States right now is an open, direct confrontation between the left and the right about who can be more aggressive against trade and especially against China. This isn't a contest between open and closed. This is a contest between two different versions of closed. The United States is the world's premier power not because of globalization. If you remove the NAFTA states from the equation, we actually only trade for about 3, maybe 3.5% of our GDP. We are a continental economy, and that doesn't mean there are no links, but an order of magnitude below that of what exists in places like Germany or Russia or China. I'm an internationalist. People who believe my way have lost each and every one of the last 7 elections, well, I guess until the last one, when we didn't even have a standard bearer in the race. Americans have consistently gone with the more inwardly focused candidate, and that includes the transition from Trump to Biden.
Let's just entertain the idea for a second that you're wrong. What would you see as the biggest risks internationally, geopolitically, from a Trump second term?
Number one is most likely an American withdrawal of support for Ukraine, and then not too long thereafter, we get one of two things: a massive rearmament of Europe, which I find a little spooky, or a Russian surge throughout Ukraine that comes up against the European border and then pushes beyond, which is equally spooky. Neither of those are good for American strategic interests in the long run. And the second issue is you would probably take this relatively targeted but very robust approach that the Biden administration has taken against the Chinese economy and replace it with something much more broad spectrum. And we would probably see a collapse of the Chinese-American trading relationship before the United States had built out sufficient industrial plant to get on without a China. It's not a problem to have a low fertility rate. It's a problem to have a low fertility rate for decades. In the case of countries like Italy and Germany, they aged past the theoretical point where they could recover back in the 1980s. And this is the decade when those two, plus the Koreans, and probably, although maybe not the Japanese, basically age into a degree of obsolescence that they just won't have enough people to pay taxes. They won't have enough people to consume goods. They won't have enough people to produce the goods in the first place. So we're looking at a radically different economic model for all of these countries and more to survive. But no one is in a worse position than the Chinese. According to the data that the Chinese have updated in just the last year, they're now claiming they've got a fertility rate that is 1/4 or below replacement levels in all of their major cities. And they're now saying they've been below the American birth rate in excess of 45 years. So if you listen to some of their own internal government statisticians, they're now estimating that they've actually overcounted their population by over 100 million people. And most independent demographers say it's probably closer to a shortfall of 250 million. So we're looking at a demographic collapse of the Chinese state within 10 years. And that assumes nothing else goes wrong. No trade war with the United States, no government breakdown because of the cult of personality that has arisen around Chairman Xi, no conflict, nothing. There's a lot of other stuff going on right now that suggests they're doing their best to speed up their own demise. And when I hear countries like New Zealand trying to keep a foot in both worlds, I'm like, that's not going to work. Right now, I'd argue New Zealand has a foreign policy towards China very, very similar to what the Germans had towards the Russians just before the war. They thought that you could have your security from one side and your economics from another side. You can deal with a genocidal government on one side and still trade with them, and it's all right. Until one day, it very clearly isn't. And the Germans are paying for that oversight with their economic model. I think the Kiwis are a little smarter. The Germans built an industrial model that was based on global access. That requires globalization. That was a flaw. It's based on American oversight. We're getting out of that business. That was a flaw. It was based on bottomless demand out of China. I would argue we haven't gotten to that flaw yet. And it was based on endless supplies of cheap energy out of Russia. So I would argue from the German point of view, 3 of the 4 pillars have already collapsed and the 4th one's in the process of it. New Zealand, because you're not known as a manufacturing partner, you're a high-value, value-added agricultural exporter with some very high manufacturing stuff on the top end, that can shift. Just like the Australians, there are other markets out there that need what you do. And so I would anticipate, with not too much of an adjustment, you'll be able to shift to Southeast Asia, not too hard, not too difficult, and you might even be able to pick up a little bit of the slack in Latin America as those economies grow. What I would just caution about is believing that this 2-pillar system that you have right now is a good idea, because it doesn't serve your economic interests, and it definitely doesn't serve your cultural or your strategic interests. Well, ANCUS is new, and it was primarily designed to anchor American and to a lesser degree English power in Australia. So anything that is hung on it on the side, I'm not saying it can't succeed, but that was not the original intent. So if there is an extension of AUKUS to involve New Zealand or more likely Japan, it is going to look very, very different than the original deal. So from my point of view, it's not so much the format of the deal that New Zealand does or does not decide to deal or to negotiate with the United States. It's more about the tone and the scale. So let me give you an example, because I think this is probably going to be the best path forward for you. The Japanese realize that from an economic, demographic, and strategic point of view, their capacity to function as an independent power is gone. The birth rate's been too low for too long. China is too up front and center. And the Americans through the 80s, the 90s, and to a lesser degree the 2000s basically decided that Japan can't be part of the American economic family because it was simply too predatory. So, under the previous government of Shinzo Abe, we basically had the Japanese come to the United States, say flat out they can't go it alone, and come up with an absolutely humiliating trade deal that gave in to Washington on each and everything that had ever been an irritant in the relationship. All of them resolved not just by the American point of view, but from the Trump point of view. And it worked. And Japan is now part of the American inner circle of allies, and probably, if they can get their cyber defense back up, is going to be joining something like the Five Eyes in the not too distant future. The Japanese are the only people who have seen what's coming and gotten ahead of it. New Zealand, if they want to be part of this network, is going to have to do something similar. Now, you have the advantage of not being a frontline state. You don't need the long-range air-launched cruise missiles that the Australians were so desperately after. You certainly don't need a nuclear submarine. So for you, the barrier to entry is lower, but it's going to be no less comprehensive. And so you're going to have to look through your entire economic structure about what really, truly, deeply matters to you that the United States doesn't like, and then decide if that's a price you're willing to pay.